Isn't it true, sir, that your questionable wife has her own TV show and hangs out with celebrities and does fashion magazines? Have her own privacy? My love, I will do anything for your privacy.
Seriously, it's driving me crazy. The prince plays drums all day. I don't even think he has a job.
Paris Fashion Week 2024. The cameras are flashing everywhere. Influencers are positioned perfectly, and the front row seats at the Balenciaga show are filled with the industry's most powerful figures. Into this scene, Meghan Markle walked in, expecting a triumphant wave of applause, a moment that would signal her grand return. What she got instead was silence. A cold, expensive, and deeply awkward silence. And here's the wildest part. That silence didn't just end there. It became the loudest moment of the year when the creators of South Park took that exact energy and turned it into comedy that hit in a way no one saw coming. Listen, we've all seen celebrities get roasted before. It's part of the game. But this wasn't just another celebrity takedown. This was something else entirely. This was different because South Park didn't need to invent wild storylines or make things up. They just held up a mirror to what the world was already watching, and what people saw in that reflection made them laugh harder than any fabricated joke ever could. They took the existing footage, the real-life awkwardness, and simply presented it back to the world. Now, what happened next and why that moment became so culturally significant is where things get really interesting. It would mean the world to us here at the Ruby Report if you'd hit that like button and subscribe, because the way this all unfolded, from a silent fashion show to a global comedy phenomenon, is absolutely wild. Let's dive in. Here's what Meghan and her team clearly wanted from Paris Fashion Week. Headline screaming, Meghan returns in style. They were banking on fashion influencers buzzing about every single outfit choice, creating a full comeback moment that would completely reset the public narrative. Balenciaga gave her those coveted front row seats, expecting their brand to get a global splash from her presence. The cameras were positioned to catch every angle, every smile, every seemingly candid interaction. This was supposed to be the event where everything finally turned around for her, the beginning of her redemption arc. But that is not what happened. The crowd's reaction was visibly muted. It was polite, sure, but it was muted in that specific way that is almost worse than outright negativity. There was no standing ovation. There were no excited whispers rippling through the crowd. There was just this strange, uncomfortable quiet. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and the energy just isn't there for you? That's exactly what this was, but magnified by hundreds of cameras broadcasting it to the world. And when you're someone who has built an entire career on capturing and holding attention, silence isn't neutral. It's a form of rejection. The cameras caught every single second of that awkwardness. But like almost everything Meghan touches, even this small, awkward moment didn't just fade away. It turned into a full-blown, internet-wide production. Within hours of the show, the clips started circulating everywhere. We're talking thousands of them, spreading across every social media platform, showing different angles, different moments, but all of them revealing the exact same thing, a person trying incredibly hard to make a moment happen, while the room simply wasn't feeling it. And the internet does what it does best. People replayed the clips frame by frame. They zoomed in on her facial expressions. They created side-by-side comparisons of her and other attendees. And here's the thing, people weren't even being particularly mean at first. They were just genuinely confused. The comment sections were filled with sincere questions like, wait, is she okay? And why does this feel so scripted? Get this. The memes about her appearance started trending before the official fashion articles even had a chance to drop. Usually, it's the other way around, right? A big fashion moment happens, the press writes about it, and then maybe, if it's notable enough, it becomes a meme. This time, social media decided the narrative before the traditional media could even attempt to spin it. And the narrative they decided on was that something felt off. Not necessarily wrong, just performed. It was like watching someone trying to act natural instead of just being natural. The comparisons people were making weren't even harsh. They were just pointing out how the whole thing felt less like a spontaneous public appearance and more like a scene from a reality show where every single person in the room knows the cameras are rolling. We saw these overly posed, supposedly candid shots, the laughs that seemed perfectly timed for the nearest photographer, and the waves to the crowd that looked painstakingly rehearsed. There was nothing scandalous about it, just this growing, collective sense that audiences were watching a performance rather than experiencing an authentic moment. And that feeling, that's what sticks. That's what lingers long after the event itself ends, because audiences today have gotten incredibly good at spotting the difference between what's genuine and what's manufactured. They can smell a setup from a mile away. Now, the writers at South Park were watching all of this unfold, too. They saw the same thing everyone else did. They caught the same weird, performed energy. And they recognized it for exactly what it was, a perfect setup for satire. Here's where South Park enters the picture, the show that has made an absolute art form out of spotting cultural absurdity and turning it into biting comedy. They didn't need months of research or a team of investigators. They just needed what was already playing out on everyone's social media feeds. The awkward Fashion Week moment, the endless memes, the confused reactions from the public, it was all sitting there, ready to be turned into something bigger. The episode dropped, and it hit different. It didn't invent new storylines. It simply took what viewers had already been noticing for years and amplified it just enough to make it impossible to ignore. That's the secret to great satire. It doesn't have to make stuff up. It just holds up a mirror and makes the reflection so sharp that you can't unsee what you're looking at. Listen, South Park has used silence as a comedic weapon before, but this time it was perfectly deployed. In the episode, the character based on Meghan sits in that front row seat, expecting her big moment to land, and the cartoon crowd, they just stare. They replicated that muted reaction that is somehow more devastating than any amount of booing could ever be. Because when you're performing for attention and absolutely nobody gives you any, that's the precise moment when the performance itself becomes visible. The brilliance of the episode wasn't in the jokes, it was in the timing. The episode aired right when people were still processing what they had seen at the fashion show, still trying to figure out why it felt so strange. South Park gave them the language for it. They turned that vague, uncomfortable feeling into something specific and tangible. The comedy worked because it wasn't about creating something new, it was about naming something that already existed. Get this, the parody didn't even have to exaggerate that much, and that's what made it so brutal. They showed a character who constantly changes her persona depending on who is in the room, adjusting her entire performance based on the audience. Viewers recognized it instantly because they had been watching that same pattern play out in real life for years. We've seen the humanitarian moment, then the powerful businesswoman pivot, then the laid-back lifestyle guru era. Each new identity was carefully presented, and each one felt just a little too rehearsed to be believed. Here's the genius part. The show used the characters' own contradictions as the punchline, demanding attention while simultaneously claiming to want none, curating every single public moment down to the second while calling it authentic, building an entire brand around being relatable from a palace in Montecito, a setup that's anything but. South Park didn't need to make any of that up. They just put it all in one place and let the audience connect the dots for themselves. Now listen, silence in comedy is everything. When that animated crowd doesn't react, when they just sit there looking deeply uncomfortable, that long, awkward pause does more work than any punchline could. That's the moment viewers at home recognize, because they've seen that exact energy before. They felt that secondhand embarrassment watching someone try way too hard to be liked. The cartoon wasn't showing them something new, it was showing them something deeply familiar in a way that made it impossible to look away. The episode understood something crucial about our modern world. Authenticity isn't about being real anymore, it's about looking real. It's about performing naturalness so flawlessly that people forget it's a performance at all. But audiences have gotten really, really good at spotting when something is staged. They know when the candid shot is actually the 15th take, or when the spontaneous moment was planned out days in advance. South Park made that entire mechanism visible. They took all those little moments that felt slightly off, the carefully timed laugh, the wave that looks a little too practiced, the pose that's just a bit too perfect for someone who is supposedly caught off guard. And they lined them all up in a row so you couldn't miss the pattern anymore. Meghan Markle reportedly said she cried over the South Park episode, but the rest of the world just laughed. And when you see it all together through the lens of satire, that's when the pattern becomes painfully obvious. What South Park really nailed wasn't just one awkward moment at a fashion show, it was the bigger pattern of behavior people had been watching for years. It addressed the question of what happens when someone becomes less of a person and more of a constantly shifting brand. Listen, everyone in the entertainment industry has some level of image management. That's completely normal. But there is a massive difference between having a public persona and becoming a collection of different personas that switch depending on what's trending that week. That's what South Park zeroed in on. The character in the episode shifts constantly. In one scene, she's the serious humanitarian, deeply concerned about global issues. In the next scene, she's the cutthroat businesswoman, talking about brands, deals, and monetization. Then, a moment later, she's the wellness guru, sharing tips for a balanced life. Each version of her is polished, carefully presented, and just different enough from the last one that you start to wonder which one, if any, is actually real. Get this, that's not exaggeration, it is pure observation. People watching at home had been seeing the exact same thing play out over the years. There was the royal rebel era, then the victimhood narrative, then the female empowerment phase, then the entrepreneur chapter, and most recently, the wellness influencer moment. Each new identity was launched with a series of high-profile interviews and glossy photo shoots, and each one felt like a complete and total reinvention. Now, here's the thing about reinvention. It works brilliantly when it feels genuine. When an artist evolves their sound, or when a public figure genuinely discovers new passions, audiences absolutely love that journey. But when the reinvention happens too quickly, when the new version of a person is launched before anyone has had time to process the last one, that's when people start to get suspicious. South Park showed a character who couldn't stick with any single identity long enough for it to actually land and feel credible. She was always pivoting, always adjusting her brand based on what she thought might get the best public response. And viewers recognized that pattern immediately. They had seen the humanitarian work that got quietly dropped, the business ventures that were announced with great fanfare and then disappeared without a trace, and the causes that were championed passionately for a month and then quietly abandoned. The episode nailed this by showing just how exhausting it is to watch. The character introduces herself differently depending on who she's talking to, and the joke isn't just that she's doing it. Lots of people in entertainment do that. The joke is how transparent and obvious it has all become, how you can almost see the strategy meeting and the PR team's notes behind every single public appearance. Listen, audiences have gotten so smart about personal branding. They understand Instagram curation, they know how public relations works, and they can spot when someone is workshopping their identity like it's a new product launch. And once you see that mechanism, you can't unsee it. That's what South Park did. They made the mechanics of it all visible. And to an audience, that looks like someone who doesn't really know who they are, someone who is just trying on different identities to see which one gets the best reaction. It paints a picture of someone more interested in being famous than in being known, and that's a vibe that just doesn't land anymore, not when audiences today value authenticity above almost everything else. Let's talk about the Balenciaga choice for a moment, because the symbolism here was almost too perfect for satire. The show's creators have never hidden their opinions about performative activism or overly curated public personas. And here you have a fashion house dealing with its own significant PR issues, trying to rebuild its reputation after some highly questionable campaign choices. And who shows up, front and center in the front row? Someone else who is on a years-long mission to rehabilitate their own public image. Listen, this connection was not lost on anyone. You had two separate entities in the same room, both desperately trying to convince the world that they've changed, that they've learned their lesson, that they've grown. Both were running full-scale PR campaigns about fresh starts and new beginnings. Both were hoping that people would just forget the past controversies and focus on whatever new narrative they were pushing that week. South Park saw this dynamic and recognized it immediately as two reputation management machines colliding, both trying so hard to look effortless, while everyone in the room could see the immense effort. It's like watching actors in a scene where they're supposed to be acting casual, but you can see them struggling to remember their lines. Here is where things really shifted. Before the South Park episode, there was this strange hesitation in how people, especially in the media, talked about what they were seeing. Entertainment journalists wrote carefully worded pieces that danced around their real observations. Late-night hosts made gentle, softball jokes that never actually landed on the core point. The entertainment industry has always been cautious about certain topics. There's an unspoken rule about who you can openly mock and who needs to be handled with kid gloves. So, for a long time, the public conversation stayed polite and on the surface. People in Hollywood saw the same awkward moments everyone else did, but saying it publicly felt far too risky. Then South Park aired, and something changed overnight. Get this, within 24 hours, the episode was absolutely everywhere. It wasn't just viral for 5 minutes, it was actively shaping how everyone talked about the entire situation. All those observations that felt too harsh to say out loud had now been said through the safe filter of comedy. All those patterns people had noticed had been laid out in a simple cartoon form. And here's what's wild: comedy creates permission. When satire lands this hard, it signals to the rest of the culture that it's okay to have this conversation now. The hesitation completely disappeared because South Park had already gone there, and people laughed. The memes flooded in. TikTok creators broke down the parallels between the show and reality. YouTube channels analyzed how frighteningly accurate it was. The episode became the official framework for how everyone talked about the topic. Late-night shows that were previously making gentle jokes suddenly got much bolder. They referenced South Park directly and made observations that would have felt way too sharp just a week before. Here's the thing about cultural permission: once it's granted, you can never take it back. Entertainment reporters started writing more direct pieces, and opinion writers used language that actually named what was happening instead of hinting at it. South Park made it acceptable to analyze this as a cultural phenomenon. Even PR professionals started referencing the episode in their own industry analyses, using the parody as a case study for when image management becomes too obvious and backfires. The episode created a vocabulary. Phrases from the show became shorthand for discussing celebrity culture in general. The real power of the satire was that it didn't just make fun of something, it fundamentally changed how we are all allowed to talk about it. Here's what happened next. The episode didn't just get views and then disappear. It became self-sustaining. Every clip, every line, turned into new content that just kept spreading. The internet took what South Park created and ran with it. Meme accounts dedicated their entire feeds to the jokes. Commentary channels built hours of content around it. It became cultural shorthand. And here's the brutal part: once you become a cultural punchline, you lose control of your own story. People start to filter everything you do through the joke they already know. Every new business venture was met with South Park comparisons. Every charity appearance got the same treatment. The parody created a framework that audiences now use to interpret everything. So here we are. Paris Fashion Week was supposed to be a comeback. Instead, it became the setup for one of the most effective and devastating pieces of satire in recent memory. South Park didn't destroy anything that wasn't already crumbling. They just pointed their finger at what everyone was already seeing. This isn't really about one person or one awkward moment. It's about what happens when the performance becomes more famous than the person performing, when the image management becomes so obvious that audiences can't see anything else. So, what do you think? Did South Park just make a funny episode, or did they actually capture something real and significant about modern celebrity culture? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I really want to hear what you think about all of this. And if you made it this far, you know the drill. Hit that like button and subscribe to the Ruby Report if you haven't already. We are breaking down more stories just like this one, so turn on those notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.